Okay, I hope everyone's doing well. It's hard to believe this is the last week of April. We started in January when it was cold and snowy, and nobody even had heard of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. So we've come a long way. But I hope everyone's doing well. Just to remind you, this will be the last YouTube lecture. Next week will be the second exam. We'll talk a little bit about that. I had some computer problems this weekend. I wasn't able to send out an email with all of your missing assignments. I will get one out, if not today, tomorrow for all of you. But just to remind you that all these things are due next week when you turn your second exam in. And some of the things that are due, last week we had the assignment of retirement, uh, sources of income when you retire. This week we're going to be talking about estate planning. So when we get into that in a few minutes, I'll give you the exact assignment. I remind you also, many of you have already turned these in, but by next week is due your term paper and your book report, both 4 to 5 pages long. The ones that I've received have been excellent. I've really enjoyed them. Some of you still haven't turned in the 3 articles also, so make sure you do that to get credit for that. But again, I'll be sending out an email to those that have items that have not yet been turned in. I want to start off today, before we get into the last chapter, which is chapter 19 on estate planning, by talking about Susie Orman. I asked all of you to watch the Susie Orman DVD, The 9 Steps to Financial Freedom. And I think most, if not all of you, have watched it because I told you to send me an email and you get credit for it. We're going to go over that in a couple minutes, but what I want to go over first, I saw an article by Susie Orman last week, I think it was later last week on MSN on my computer, about some things to do and not to do during the coronavirus crisis that we're in. And, everyone's circumstance is a little bit different. The nice thing is that all of you here that are taking this class and watching this DVD or this YouTube presentation by myself work for a great company with Discover. It doesn't mean that you don't have some needs, spouses, children, whatever the case may be. But here are some things from Susie Orman. And by the way, anything we talk about with Susie, potential test material for next week. Number 1, she said, pay your bills. She said, and this is kind of the counsel that I gave you earlier, if you can't pay your bills, or there's a reason you can't, go to the person you owe money to, whether it's rent, any house payment, whatever the case may be. Tell them why you can't and tell them what you can do. So pay your bills. Number 2, she said, is don't pull out of the stock market. We're in it, and that's everything that I've said. We're in it for the long term. The market actually has been going up bit by bit as states start to make plans for reopening, and hopefully summer comes and maybe we get a little bit closer to the end of the coronavirus crisis that we're in. If you got a stimulus check, and many of us did, or many of you did, she said, save that. And her advice was kind of like Dave Ramsey, put that in your emergency fund. Very good advice there. She did say that if you own a home and you have the opportunity to refinance, this is an excellent time. Mortgage rates have never been lower. A couple of my children refinanced earlier this year, and it worked out very, very good for them. Somewhat what we just mentioned on the stimulus check, she said, have an emergency fund. This goes hand in hand with what Dave Ramsey advises to have. Her word for credit, I loved it. It's just the word that I use. She said, be cautious in your use of credit. Because you work for a great company in Discover. I work for a great company with Cincinnati. But who knows how long this is going to last. There could be, you never know when changes are going to come down the road. So just be cautious. She also said if you have the opportunity, invest even more money. The nice thing about the mutual fund that we've talked about, that many of you have already set up, is it's very flexible. If you're putting in $50 a month and you need to reduce it down to say 20 or 30, you can easily do that. She mentioned don't touch your retirement. The nice thing is that most 401ks, I don't know how it is at Discover, where I work here at the Cincinnati, we cannot touch our 401k. So that's good. And she reiterated at the end by saying stocks will come down. So again, she said, don't pull out of the market. So I think there's some good, sound, timely advice by Susie. As I said, I've been listening to her, reading her for many years. A lot of respect for her. She is great. Okay, let's go over the Susie Orman video that hopefully most, if not all of you, have already seen. Again, you've got the link to it. Make sure you do. But these are kind of the highlights that I got out of it. That you'll be responsible on the test next week. Again, this is the 9 Steps to Financial Freedom by Susie Orman. And she started out, as you remember, and I mentioned this last week, but I want to reiterate it. It's never too late to start. It's never too late to start investing. It's never too late to start budgeting. As I told you last week, I've heard this before, it's never too late to start a good habit. It's never too late to drop a bad habit. So just some good thoughts there. But no matter what your age and circumstances may be, it's never too late to start. If I remember right in the DVD, Susie said that she works with many people in their 50s, 60s, even into their 70s to get them into budgeting and investment program. And we have nothing but the future in front of us. Some obviously have more years than others. It's never, ever too late to start. Another thing I think that I liked, just a couple of the highlights, she said, be honest. Remember what I said in your budgeting, the only way this is going to work is to be honest. And by the way, that's one assignment that I forgot to mention that is due, one of your big ones, along with the term paper and the book report. I'm glad I remembered it now, is your budget. And I do not need to see the budget worksheet. That's confidential, where you spend your money. It's on an honor system, but I do want you to email me that you did, to the best of your ability, do the budget and keep your budget during the months of February, March, and April. If you do that, you'll get the credit. But we talked about being honest. I'm not talking so much about morality here per se. I'm sure that all of you, as I said, are honest, or you wouldn't be working for, be in the positions you're at in such a great company as Discover. Think about being honest with ourselves. When we do the budgeting, you got to write down all your expenses, even though sometimes you go over budget. Sometimes we have a weak moment and maybe spend some money where we shouldn't, but be honest. And she said, another step, she said, and I love this one, be responsible to your loved ones. This is interesting. We have in the world today, and there's nothing wrong with this per se, a philosophy that says pay yourself first. In other words, your 401k, your mutual fund, your investments. You remember who Susie said to pay first? It wasn't yourself. It was a charity, or maybe your parents or grandparents, some loved one. I think that is great advice. There's an old saying that says the more you give, the more you receive. And it's true. Now we got to be prudent in what we give and make sure that it makes sense. But I think it is a great habit to get into, to give to some charity. Now, sometimes we think of a charity only as a religious organization, a church or something like that. If you don't have an affiliation or an affinity with one you feel comfortable with, there's got to be something out there where you can give. Hospitals, colleges, even some organizations like Planned Parenthood, the Sierra Club, the NRA, whatever your choice may be. My only thought is if you're doing a non-religious one, make sure that it has that tax exempt status so that you can take it as a tax deduction. Another thing that Susie talked about, and you remember the principle, she even did the mathematical illustration, which of course you won't have to do, but it's called dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging is basically where we put money into an account, a savings account or an investment account, every month, every payday, whatever the case may be. This is what we do in our 401k, and then we get the benefit of the compounding earlier. So that is much more to our advantage than saving all the money or putting, say, $2,000 into an account at the end of the year, rather than putting maybe $40 a week or whatever the case may be. But that is dollar cost averaging, okay? And that is our 6th step of investing over time over all instead of all at once. Our ninth step, I think this is really important to remember. I always love this, and that is remember your self-worth is far greater than your net worth. We live in a society that measures, a lot of our success by how much money we make, cars we drive, where we live, things of this particular nature. Really, those things are, it's important that we have the things that we need, but our real worth comes from our self-worth. And so remember, our self-worth is far greater than our net worth. I love the way that she puts that in. So those are some thoughts from Susie Orman. Again, I thought her presentation was excellent, as I did with Dave Ramsey that we saw earlier in the semester. I hope all of you have watched it. Please watch it. Number one, to get your 5 points credit, honestly. But number two, you will enjoy it. Susie Orman is one intelligent person. She has had, kind of like Dave Ramsey, it's kind of interesting. Both of them had their ups and downs, had to file bankruptcy, had some good times and some bad times. But they picked themselves up. They exercised a great ability of self-discipline. They didn't lose faith in themselves, set some goals, and were able to overcome some serious financial setbacks to where now they're giving us advice in a good way. So that's Susie Orman. So again, you're going to have some test questions from both Susie Orman, the DVD that you've watched, and also from the points that I mentioned that Susie said that we should be doing as we pull through and pull out of the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, want to wrap things up with this presentation on estate planning. A lot of people don't like to talk about estate planning because obviously it involves death. It's never a pleasant subject. I can remember talking about it a few times with my mother before she passed away. My father passed away rather suddenly. I don't think we had any conversations with him, but with my mom we did. And it, obviously, you can say it wasn't on the highlight reels, but it was something that needed to be discussed. I love on page 657, if you look, and this is just something you can self-answer, but a couple of these self-questions. I believe estate planning is only for the rich and famous. Agree, neutral, or disagree? If I die without a will, my legal state will control the distribution of my estate. In addition to my will, should I provide a last letter of instruction? A couple other questions there. But basically, estate planning is this. It is where you're going to take control and decide what is going to happen to your estate when you're no longer around. That's the long and short of it. And estate planning is important because, as was alluded to just a minute ago, if you don't make the plans for your estate, then wherever you live, your estate will be probated or executed or taken care of according to the laws of that particular state. Now, that's generally not necessarily bad. We'll talk about estate tax, which will affect very few of us, quite frankly, but in most cases, if it's just a normal type family situation and someone doesn't have a will, the money will go to the spouse, the surviving spouse. If there is no surviving spouse, it will be divided equally among children. But there are unusual circumstances that come along. There may not be, any children. There might be children from a prior marriage, a prior relationship. There might be any number of issues that come along. So that's why we want to do estate planning, so that we have control over it. And then when we pass away and move on, that things will be divided up according to our desires and the will that we have, rather than that of the state. So basically, estate planning is just doing exactly that. Now, in most cases, if you're married, as was mentioned, everything will go to your surviving spouse, and unless you designate different. If you haven't married, that's where it's an interesting question. If you haven't married, you have no children, where will the money go? Well, it depends on the state that you're in the way the state would disperse it, and that again is why you need to have a will. Now, there is a great checklist on page 659. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of it, but a couple important questions here to ask yourself, or maybe if you're helping your parents with estate planning somewhere down the line. Okay, good questions. Number one, where are your previous year's tax returns? Where's your safe deposit box? What is in it? Okay. What kinds of life insurance do you have, and where are the life insurance policies? You know, I work in insurance, although it's not life insurance. I work in property and casualty, as I mentioned to you. But each year there are a number of life insurance people that pass away that have, usually the smaller, but have some life insurance that is never collected upon. Why? Because they never tell anyone. They don't have it in a place where their descendants or children would find it, so they can be able to cash it in. So you need to make sure that your life insurance, that the documentation of this is where it should be. Okay, number 4. Can you locate all these policies? Life, health, automobile, so on and so forth. Who are the beneficiaries? Okay. Do you and your spouse have a will? We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But obviously, if you have a will, where is it? Who is the attorney who drew it up? Do you have a record of you and your spouse's social security number? Do you have important certificates, marriage, birth certificates, adoption certificates, military records, if appropriate? Do you know or do you have down the name, the address, and the phone number of the insurance agent that sold you the life insurance policy? Again, of the attorney who executed your will. Okay. These are just a few things. Oh, it does mention also, talk a little bit about, how about your funeral? Burial arrangements, have you paid for any of that? Do you have any wishes or any desires, as final services are made for you and for your family, and how they're going to participate? Do you have a trust? We'll talk about these things. It does talk, and this is important on 660, and I agree with this. We talked about opportunity costs. Remember the very first, maybe it was the second week in January, we talked about opportunity costs. Opportunity cost here of rationalizing. You know, just to emphasize again, this is, as I've said before, we're talking about, some different aspects in this class. There's some decisions that just have to be done correct the first time, because you do not get a second chance. And we talked about that with life insurance. Well, obviously, the same principle applies to the element of estate planning, because we're talking about the passing of a loved one. And obviously, it will only happen once. So this has got to be done correctly. As I said, the majority of decisions and things we do in life, if we don't do them right the first time, we can correct them, we can apologize or do whatever's necessary, and then take care of it the correct way. Again, estate planning, it's got to be done right the first time. And the opportunity cost of rationalizing or procrastination is just not good. Let me just share one personal thing, if you don't mind. My father died, quite a few years ago, and he died suddenly. He had a heart attack, and he'd had some heart issues, but he just kind of dropped dead, which in some ways was nice. Certainly no suffering, but in other ways it was sudden, and it was a jolt to us, and certainly far younger than we like. But this was back in Greensboro, North Carolina, where my folks were living. I remember I flew back. I was the oldest son. Kind of took charge of the estate planning, I guess, and we were sitting in a couple days after my dad's passing in an attorney's office there in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'll never forget what the attorney said. He looked at the documentation we took in of all the things we've talked about, tax returns, certificates, life insurance, so on and so forth. Made this statement. He said, "Your dad sure took good care of you guys in death." And I remember I told him, I said, "Well, he took great care of us when we were alive, too. He was a wonderful father." But What a great compliment. And what a great way to kind of exit this life for my father. To get a compliment like that. Although we hated to see him go, we miss him terribly still. He was a wonderful father and a wonderful person. I couldn't have asked for more. But what a great compliment. He took care of us in death. So, procrastination and rationalization doesn't do anyone any good. I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but this is mortality. This is not a religious class, as I said, or philosophy. But we all know that sooner or later we're going to leave this life. And the better prepared we are for us and for those who will have to go through our loss, we're just set such a good example for them. Okay. Now, talks on 661 about some of the important certificates again that you need to make sure that people can find when you're not around. Birth certificates, marriage certificates, any legal name changes, adoptions, military records are great to have. Among the other things, obviously your social security documents, insurance policy, bank account numbers, your 401k, your mutual fund that we're starting to invest in, registration of automobiles, again, titles to stocks and bonds. Now let's talk about a will. Basically is that every adult really should have a will. A will is a legal document which basically declares what a person wants to have done with their assets when they pass away. Every adult, obviously, should have a will. My advice is to find an attorney who specializes in estate planning. There are certainly those out there. That's certainly what my wife and I did when we set up our will. So every adult needs a will. And you don't see it as much as you used to, but sometimes on TV they used to have these do-it-yourself will kits. You could pay $35 or $40. Supposedly it was passed on by attorneys that you've never heard of. I would be totally against that. This is an item. You've got to do it right the first time. So go to an attorney who specializes in wills. The nice thing with the will, it'll cost a few $100s, but it's a one-shot cost. You pay it off. It's not like you got to pay that same amount, $400 or $500 every year. And once you have the will, if you make changes down the line, they don't cost any money. There is an example of a last will and testament on Exhibit 19.1. It's fairly generic. Most wills kind of start that way, and then when you sit down and counsel and talk with the attorney, changes that can be made. Again, it mentions on 663. I mean, things change in our lives. There's deaths, there's divorces, there's adoptions, all sorts of things can come down the road, and that's why you've got to, make changes from time to time on your will. These are called codicils. You don't need to remember that term, but a will, once you've executed it, you can go back and make changes with little or no cost, depending a little bit on the attorney. Probate is the legal procedure of validating a will. When somebody passes away, the will pulled out, but it has to go through probate. In other words, they have to make sure that the signatures are legal and everything is according that it should be. Also, the court will go through, and before anything is dispersed, they will make sure that all debts have been paid. And so probate generally takes quite a while. I know when my mother passed away, it probably took, 8 to 12 months before it was finally probated, and then we could finally decide on the disbursement of the funds and how we wanted to do that. Okay? There are some terms on 664. I'm not too concerned about that per se. I would just say again, as you set up your will, please get a professional, an attorney who specializes in this, because one of the persons that will be important will be the executor. This is the person who will kind of be in charge of making sure that everything is taken care of. As I told you, I was the executor when my father passed away, and when my mom, actually my brother and I, on both of them, kind of took care of that. But you just need to make sure that you have a competent person who knows you and will take care of it in a timely and in an honest method. One thing, when you set up a will, and I remember my wife and I doing this when our kids were younger, and that is a guardian, and that is if your kids are under age 18, you'll need to set up who's going to be the guardian, who's going to take care of them. That's something to think about, or you have different family relationships, but you need to make sure and that this is taken care of. Otherwise, in this case, the court would decide. And just not to bring this up too much, but we just had the tragic circumstance of a young couple with 3 children. Very tragically, were murdered in West Jordan, and not sure, who's going to end up taking care of those 3 little kids. One of which was only about 5 or 6 months. But again, that's something you'll want to put in your will. On page 666 also is what's known as the 10 Commandments of a will. Work closely, obviously, with your spouse. Write the will to conform to your present wishes, but realize that you can make changes over time. Your attorney will take care of this, but you don't choose a beneficiary as a witness. It says here, if you're remarrying, consider signing a prenuptial to protect your children. I would just say this: if you're remarrying, you've got children from a prior marriage, you're looking at the will and a prenuptial, you need to get some good, sound legal advice so that the interests of people are being taken care of, both your children, your new spouse, whatever direction you go. One thing I do agree on number 5 on these 10 commandments of making a will, and that is to use dollar or percentages rather than dollar amounts, because when you pass away, the amounts can change, the amount of your estate can change. I think that actually is a good idea. Sign the original copy, keep it in a safe place. Obviously, your attorney will have a copy of the will, but it's always good to let the executor, someone in the family, know where the will is also. It does talk about rewriting, altering the will. As we said, circumstances change over time. Generally, you can just go back to your current attorney, and it's called a codicil. Again, you won't need that name. It's on page 668. Will modify the will, and generally there is no cost. Let's talk about a different document, which is part of a will, and that's a living will. And that is the document that will enable an individual, while well and feeling good, to express the intention of whether their life is to be continued if the person becomes terminally ill. I'm a great believer in getting a living will. I can still remember, as uncomfortable as it was a little bit, discussing this with my mother. But if you don't have a living will, then the decision has to be made in essence by the children, which is a tough decision to make, as you can appreciate. So the best thing is for you, for us, kind of like Susie Orman says, we're responsible for our financial future. We're going to be responsible for this. We're going to take this responsibility upon our shoulders and do what we want to do in that particular direction. A letter of last instruction. Sometimes people like to put this in on page 670. It'll be read at the will. A great time to express love and appreciation, maybe words of encouragement to those you love and those that have been so important in your life. Now, I'll talk a little bit about trust. Not an awful lot. Susie Orman talked a little bit about it, but a lot of times people will set up a trust. A trust basically is an agreement, a legal agreement, in which one's assets are held by a trustee. There's two types of revocable trusts. They can be changed by whoever sets up the trust up to the time they pass away, or irrevocable that cannot be changed under any circumstances. So my only thought is doing an irrevocable trust, you better make sure it's what you want done, because even if you change your mind, if it's irrevocable, it cannot be changed. Trusts are putting money aside for a special reason. Sometimes people like to do it for a charity, a cause, something they believe in. Sometimes people will set up a trust for children with special needs. There are all different types of trusts that you can take a look at. All I can say is, again, before you set up a trust, think it through, get a good attorney, and make sure this is really what you want to do. I think the best thing on a trust also is to make sure the people that will be affected both by the trust would receive benefit or maybe have their portion lessened. Make sure that they know about it. So everybody's on the up and up, and everybody understands what you're doing and why you're doing it. I know this is an extreme case, but I think it was Bill Gates, who obviously is a multi-billionaire, said that he has set his trust up so that 99% of his wealth will go to charity, with 1% going to his family that he designates, and that's still, I'm sure, be a lot of money given how much he is worth. But I would, I think trusts are good to take a look at. Just make sure that they're well thought out, that you and your spouse are on the same page, and again, that you let everyone know about it. Now, when you pass when someone dies, the value of the estate is basically, it kind of goes back to what we learned in the second or third week of our class, and that is, remember, a person's net worth is their total assets minus their total liabilities. And so basically what will happen is that the assets will be valued, and then, as I said, under probate, all bills will have to be paid, and then what's left over will be dispersed according to whatever the will is set up at. It's different in different states too. It talks about community property on page 676. It talks about common law marriage and when two people are living together without the benefit of being married. And so it is different in different states, and sometimes, quite frankly, the law evolves. And when you set something up, and you may not pass away or have an event happen for 20, 25, 30 years, there could be a lot of changes. That's why it's good maybe to consult an attorney every now and then if there are so-called community property. Let's talk briefly about estate taxes too. Sometimes there's a misconception of this, and people worry, and I've heard people say this, well, when I die, the government's going to get all my money. Well, that's just not true. That is completely false. Actually, some states have done away with the estate tax, but even as it stands now, your estate would have to be over $11 million. That's the exemption that you get. I doubt that too many of us, or even in this class, if you look at your parents, grandparents, all the above, not too many of us have a net worth of over $11 million. That's a lot of money. You have to have a lot of property, a lot of cash. Remember, because your net worth is your total assets minus your total liabilities. So an inheritance tax probably affects less than 5% of us here in the United States. And if you ever find yourself in that position or know someone, then gifts and trusts can be a very good thing to avoid some of those taxes. But for most of us, the great majority of Americans today, the estate tax doesn't even come into play. So when you hear someone say that, in most cases, really, it's not relevant. So don't, for goodness sakes, don't lay in bed worried about an estate tax for the great majority of us. Okay? Again, if the time comes that you're in that position or you know someone, that's when you can start taking a look at perhaps gifts, trusts, things of this particular particular nature if you want to avoid the tax. Okay, that is basically it. Let me give you the 5-point assignment, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up. Take a couple minutes just to talk about the exam. Your 5-point assignment for this week is I want you to email to me, why is estate planning so important? Okay, you got the book to read, you've heard this lecture. Why is estate planning so important? If you'll get that to me, you'll get 5 points. Okay. Now next week, over the weekend, I will put together the second exam. As I said, it's only from the first exam when we took that till the end of the semester, second half of the book. It'll be just like the first one in many ways. There'll be about 20 multiple true false, about 30 multiple choice, and probably 8 short essay. That'll be 2 to 1 page. It'll be the things that we've highlighted and talked about in class, and then going into these YouTube lectures. So I think you'll have a pretty good idea. I will email the test to Angie, and Angie will email it to all of you. Now, if we take a look at the calendar, it is really important because I have to get final grades in. I need to have all the tests back to me by Thursday, May the 7th, and I'll send it out this weekend, probably Saturday or Sunday, to Angie. I know she'll get it out to you promptly. Again, we're on an honor system. The test, like the first one, is closed book and closed note. So study all you need to from the book, your notes, everything else that you have, even if you go back and look at some of these videos. But once you start the test, you're done. I mean, as far as looking at notes or the book. So take the test. Like I said, it'll be a lot like the other one. Then go ahead and just email it to me, scan it, and email it to me back, and I will get it graded and we'll get it taken care of. Even though this class has not gone the way that we thought, because I really do miss the Tuesday lectures. I really do. Every now and then, I told you I drive by Discover when I'm going north or south on Bangerter, and I always have a tinge of regret. Like, man, I miss seeing all those wonderful students at Discover. But I'm glad that we're able to finish the class so that you can get credit, get the knowledge that you need. One other item just came to me. I'm going to remind you, your stock report also. So let's just remind ourselves, take about a minute. Your 5-point assignment today is, why should you estate plan? Last week, it's where you're going to get retirement from. Your big assignments as far as points go: term paper, book report, your budget, and your stock assignment. You've been following 10 stocks for 5 weeks. In addition to that, you've got, many of you still need to turn in the 3 articles. Again, I'll send you an email tonight or tomorrow with things that are missing. And next week, take the exam. Again, thank you so much for taking the class. If you have any questions or any issues, again, you know my phone number. You can call, you can text, or you can email, and I hopefully will be on top of this very quickly. Thank you again. I wish you all the best. Be safe, be smart, and we all have a great and bright future no matter which direction we go. Thank you.